In the late 1800s, the last of the Apache were being hunted down in their own lands. A few small bands chose to fight rather than give in. Fighting side by side with the male warriors was a powerful medicine woman. She was deadly with a bow or rifle. The wildest horses obeyed her commands. Her power to divine the movements of the enemy was vital to the legendary Apache leaders, Geronimo and Victorio, the most feared and ingenious guerrilla warriors of their time. This is a story the Apaches have closely guarded to this day, the story of a revered woman warrior who fought to the bitter end. This is the story of Lawless. As the Indian Wars were coming to a brutal, uncompromising end, a few of the Apache decided to make a final stand. They took on the United States government, which believed it was their manifest destiny to dominate the West and remove the Apache from their homeland.
The likes of Victorio and Geronimo struck terror into the hearts of the US Army and made headlines all across America. The Apache leaders, outnumbered and on the run, managed to outwit the forces of manifest destiny. But as so often happens, history worships its fighting heroes and neglects to even mention its heroines. While Geronimo and Victorio were getting all the press, the story of Lawless, the equal to any man when it came to war, was left in the dust.
The most famous of all Apache leaders, Geronimo, called her woman warrior. Her older brother, Victorio, relied on her as his most important weapon in war. Victorio said that his little sister was his right hand, as strong as any man, braver than most, and cunning in strategy. Lawless, he said, is a shield to her people.
I think Lawless' story was never really brought out in the open, or not much told about her, because she's a woman who more or less lived in a men's world. It was something that was unheard of for a woman to be in an active role like that and be riding with men. It's not eloquently told like Geronimo's story or Victorio's story. They tend to be in the background.
Lawless's legacy is unique because she was active as a warrior. Other Apache women were certainly fighters. Many others were captured, fought their way out, returned, saved their offspring in heroic ways. But Lawless was an active fighter, an active warrior, who, when it was time to fight, she joined the men.
The ghost towns and abandoned mines which bore the brunt of Apache anger are testament to the resilience of Lawless and her people. Long before the US entered the fray, the Spanish and then the Mexicans had tried but failed to kick the Apache off their land. When the US Army lowered their sights on Lawless and her homeland, they too were to learn the hard way not to underestimate Apache resolve.
In the 1840s, the Chiricahua Apache girl who had become known as Lawless grew up near a spring called Ojo Caliente in what is today southwestern New Mexico. She was one of the last generation to experience what it meant to be Apache and to be free in the homeland of her people. Her band of Chiricahua was called the Warm Springs Apache by outsiders, named after a small spring-fed pool that flows down the valley. On their seasonal round, her tribe would cover 1,000 miles in a year, hunting and gathering food from an area of the southwestern United States and northern Mexico, known as Apacheria. Lawless's older brother, Chief Victorio, would concede it all to the United States. In exchange for peace, all he asked was for a permanent homeland at Ojo Caliente.
This valley hasn't changed much since the time of Lawless. The springs bubble up out of a deep underground rift which supplies a year-round source of water in a land where drought is commonplace. And just downstream is the entrance to a narrow canyon. It's a natural fortress in case of attack. As Lawless got older and as the US Army and the miners began crowding them in, this spring-fed Eden became the centerpiece of her tribe's struggle to retain some small measure of freedom.
Like all Apache children, Lawless was encouraged to explore every detail of the wilderness and learn the essential skills of survival. Most of all, Lawless loved to ride, and often joined Victoria, who was 20 years her elder, on expeditions into the mountains and desert. He taught her where to hunt for game and to find hidden sources of water in the dry, imposing landscape. While most young Apache girls were learning to take care of the camp and prepare the food, Lawless was more interested in challenging the boys in the games of young warriors. Even in playtime, the children were told to be constantly on their guard. The threats to their lives were ever present. About the time Lawless was born, the Mexican government began paying bounties for Apache scalps. They tried to exterminate Lawless' people and take over their land. As she was growing up, Mexican bounty hunters frequently attacked the Apache camps, killing not only the male warriors, but indiscriminately slaughtering Apache women and children. The Apache declared all-out war. Raiding into Mexico was part of the social hierarchy of the tribe. The young men had to prove their courage on 4 raids before attaining the status of warrior. Returning with horses, guns, and ammunition, in war dances, the Chiricahua celebrated their victories and appealed to Yusen, the creator, for the power to be invincible. Victorio, a proven leader on their raids, would become one of the most respected of all Chiricahua chiefs for his ability to make war. As the Warm Springs Apache became increasingly under threat, little sister would emulate her brother and earn her place on the warpath.
My mother had mentioned Lawless in a lot of the stories that she told us. Victoria referred to her as my little sister. She Isaiah, so that it was shortened to Lawless. That's a term of endearment. She more than likely had an Indian name. To this day, we don't know what her Indian name might have been.
At about the age of 13, when most Apache girls are preparing for marriage and motherhood, Lawless committed herself to following the path of a warrior. As Lawless ascended into adulthood, she would also answer to a higher calling. The Apache believe that it is at this age when certain members of the tribe are granted the powers to become medicine people. One member of Lawson's band later described the test which she and the other medicine people must go through to attain their power. On a journey to Sacred Mountain, the young warrior entered the domain of the mountain spirits, who are the link between Yusen and the Apache. Alone on the mountain, they must confront their deepest fears. For 4 days they pray and endure the elements without food or water. On the 4th day, if they pass the test, the Creator may grant them the knowledge to be healers and the ability to do the impossible, such as the power possessed by Lawless. Lawless became one of the most respected of the Chiricahua medicine people. According to her fellow warriors, it was her acute ability to predict the movements of the enemy that made her indispensable on the warpath. What ΛΟΖΕΝ couldn't have foreseen was the significance of the white man's storm gathering over her homeland. She would have to call on all her powers to fight the battles that lay ahead.
These powers were considered a sacred gift from ΛΟΖΕΝ, and as such were unexplainable and should never be discussed. What is known is that, unlike most Apache women, ΛΟΖΕN never married. It's said that she had many suitors, but persuaded her brother not to make her take a husband. Perhaps her intuition told her that her calling would not leave room to look after a husband and children, but rather she should stay by the side of Victoria and protect the whole Apache nation. Her destiny was to become a great leader and a warrior in her own right.
During the Civil War, New Mexico came under the control of the California Column and a man named Carleton, General Carleton. And Carleton did not like Apaches. He did not like Indians in general. He was responsible for the long walk of the Navajos, and he sent innumerable campaigns against the Apache during the 1860s.
The Apache saw their leaders murdered and tortured under flags of truce, and their people rounded up. The blood and vengeance on both sides mounted. As the anger escalated among ΛΟΖΕN's people, Victorio tried to keep the peace.
Victoria wanted peace right from the beginning. He wanted to live in peace with his neighbors. That is within our culture. We live in harmony with nature. If we are not in harmony with nature, everything is off kilter. But he wanted his people to have a land, a place to call home.
Victorio agreed to concede all the lands of their ancestors to the United States, with the exception of a reservation at Ojo Caliente, which would remain their homeland for as long as the mountains should stand and the rivers exist. In 1874, the treaty was signed into law by President Ulysses S. Grant. But the treaty was never honored by the United States. Despite all the promises, 2 years later, the Warm Springs Apache were attacked at Ojo Caliente by the U.S. cavalry, without cause or provocation. Most of the Apache warriors were away from the camp, and many of the women and children were cut down as they tried to escape.
The turning point was perhaps at the time that his family was massacred. He lost his wife and several children. Out of that massacre, there was only 2 children of Victoria that survived.
As the women and children fled from the cavalry, ΛΟΖΕN rode to the rescue of her young nephew, who was trapped in the chaos. Braving the cavalry guns, she swooped the boy onto her horse and rode to safety. From then on, ΛΟΖΕN would never forget the deceit of the U.S. Army and the murder of her family.
For 4 years, Victoria worked very, very, very hard at maintaining the peace and keeping the reservation. He suffered the loss of a wife during an attack on his camp. He did not react to that. He enforced the rules for not going off the reservation by killing Apaches who violated it. The mindset in Washington was, let's concentrate the Indians on as few reservations as we can so that we can make use and settle the rest of the land. It was manifest destiny at its worst.
Other Chiricahua leaders, including Geronimo, were constantly harassed by the U.S. Army. Under pressure, the Apache were forced to agree to unreasonable terms as the price of peace.
During this difficult time, Geronimo would often visit Lawless and Victorio to seek their counsel. Geronimo had already developed a reputation amongst the U.S. Army as something of a troublemaker. Upon hearing that he was in the area, Geronimo was invited to engage in peace talks here at this army outpost in Ojo Caliente. But when he rode up under a flag of truce, they promptly arrested him. Without any orders from Washington, Lawless and her entire band were driven off the land they'd been promised. The army marched them, along with Geronimo, hundreds of miles to San Carlos, another reservation in the searing Arizona desert.
It's a desert, it's dry. It wasn't the high, pretty mountain country that Victorio was used to. So it basically was just a hot place to sit.
After 4 months of confinement and misery at San Carlos, Victorio, Lawless, and the Warm Springs Apache decided to make a break for it. Raiding the reservation for horses and weapons, they led a mass escape. With the cavalry in hot pursuit, Lawless and Victorio outmaneuvered their pursuers and fought their way back to New Mexico. Scattering into the safety of the vast Gila wilderness, they were almost impossible to track down.
The Apache knew that landscape very, very well, and they traveled through it many times. So when it became necessary to do it during wartime, they were already prepared to move through it. And an example of that is their cache system, where they regularly cached goods and supplies along their seasonal route. And then when war came, those supplies were there as well. When Victorio moved, he moved quickly. When he stopped, he put up fortifications. He stayed on high points where they could see who was coming. He just moved very cautiously. And those elements of fighting a guerrilla war still hold true today.
Traveling with half their band, nearly 200 warriors, women, and children, they evaded capture and made their way back home, acquiring horses and supplies as they went. In raids, Lawless' stealth was essential. According to Apache accounts, nobody was more adept at stealing horses. One cavalry officer recalled an Apache woman thought to be Lawless, who was particularly honored by the male warriors. She was renowned as one of the most dexterous horse thieves and horse breakers among the Chiricahua. Rarely did they go on a raid without her. Lawson's band returned to Ojo Caliente, and Victorio made one final appeal for their promised reservation. He immediately gave himself up to Colonel Hatch, the commanding officer in New Mexico. In a letter to his superiors in Washington, Hatch was adamant that the treaty should be upheld. In spite of his efforts, Hatch's orders were to return the Warm Springs Apache to San Carlos. When the troops arrived to enforce the order, Lawson, Victoria, and the Warm Springs Apache had gone.
As Victoria was being pushed off the reservation, there were mineral strikes, silver, near the towns of Chloride and Winston nearby. And it's quite possible that some of the local individuals who were interested in expanding the mining in that area were also interested in moving the Apaches off to open it up for mining. The settlers paid a heavy price, the military paid a heavy price. The people who were making money out of the deal, I'm not sure they paid a heavy price.
When Lawson and Victoria left Ojo Caliente for the last time, the army pursued them into the Black Range. The troops reported that on a number of occasions, Victorio yelled down to them to go away. He didn't want to fight. But by now it was clear to Lawson and the other Chiricahua leaders that the word of the White Eyes amounted to nothing more than lies, and they would never be left alone. They felt that they had no choice. Lawson and Victoria decided to go to war.
In the fall of 1879, during the first stages of the Victoria War, the hit and evade tactics of the Warm Springs Apache taught the U.S. Army a lesson in modern warfare. According to the Chiricahua and Victorio himself, his little sister Lawson was one of the masterminds of their campaign.
Outnumbered and outgunned, Lawson and Victorio led their pursuers over mountain ridges to wear them out, and then down into the desert to let them die of thirst. Where the Apache found water, the cavalry ate dust. Lawson knew every nuance of the terrain, and she was a master of the surprise attack. So when the time came to strike, they would set false trails and then bait the ragged army into their trap.
Many of the cavalry officers, veterans of the Civil War, were used to facing up to their opponents and taking them head on. But now they were fighting blind. The Apache were unseen and unheard until it was too late.
The Apaches were never interested in sacrificing men in a battle. If they could attack with some certainty of not losing any men, that's what they did. Leaders gained a reputation by having successful attacks without losing your personnel, without exposing them to risk.
The Warm Springs Apache came to rely on Lawson's intuition and tactics to keep them out of harm's way. But to prove herself in the eyes of her fellow warriors, she had to be willing to put her own life at risk. One Apache account exemplifies her individual courage. While under heavy fire, she and the other warriors were on the run. In the heat of the battle, a saddlebag full of ammunition was left behind. The Apache were dangerously low on rounds. Realizing the battle might be lost, Lawson ran back into the line of fire to retrieve the precious ammunition.
You earned a leadership if people thought you made good decisions. This is how Victoria became a leader. Lawson, because of her power and her prowess, commanded the same kind of respect. And I think that's why Lawson's name has survived as a warrior woman among the Apache.
Many of the U.S. troops dismissed what they called Apache magic, but the Chiricahua who fought with her had no doubts. Lawson's ability to predict the movements of the enemy was their greatest advantage. They believed in her power because she got results. One first-hand Apache account of the war describes how time after time, when Victoria needed to know the location of the enemy, Lawson prayed to Usen with outstretched arms and her palms open to the sky. As she turned slowly, her hands tingled when they pointed towards the direction of the enemy. The closer the adversary, the more vivid the feeling.
These Apache grew up in this environment. They were incredibly attuned to sound, sight, smell, feel. Things that we miss as we grow up in our air-conditioned houses. And if all those combine to tell you things, is that power?
Going done. Is it on because it gets in long a bit. Did it and done the sea? The check and his squin jugo car, nice not our guns to the habit.
Before going on the warpath, the powers of medicine people such as Lawless and Geronimo would be called on in their spiritual preparation for war. Rituals such as the application of war paint instilled fearlessness in the Chiricahua warriors. From their enemies' point of view, this made them incredibly dangerous.
Harlan, what goes into the powder that makes up this war paint?
It's a red rock that usually shed, fine powder at the base of it. Well, it's very hard to get this type of mineral.
I think what a lot of us don't understand is that this wasn't just used for makeup, right? There was a whole psychological and spiritual element to this and a ritual about it before they went into war.
That's correct. It protects you, and also signify that you had actually become a warrior. It's a sacred paint that's been used hundreds of years by the Apaches that have become warriors. When you apply this war paint, it has to come from the left all the way to the right. It actually has to do with Mother Nature, the planet itself, because the rotation of the Earth turns that way, clockwise. And we have to, start from the left to right, make sure that we come back safe without any injuries.
So this is like a shield?
Correct. This is like a shield because once this sacred paint is put on you, you're supposed to come back.
For months, the Warm Springs Apache worked their way up and down the Black Range, evading and attacking the U.S. cavalry with impunity. Colonel Hatch's superiors had severely underestimated the Chiricahua. Hatch brought in reinforcements, including companies of buffalo soldiers, mostly made up of freed slaves from the Civil War. But no matter how big a force Hatch threw at them, they couldn't fight what they couldn't find. In almost every encounter, Lawless and the Warm Springs Apache had the upper hand. Hatch knew that the only people who stood a chance against the Apache were other Apache. He recruited Apache scouts from the reservation in Arizona to help track them down. Lawson's band hit cavalry patrols and army garrisons, replenishing their horses, guns, and ammunition, and leaving a trail of destruction across the southwest.
So, John, tell me, what kind of guns did the Apache use?
Really, they would prefer anything they could get. They didn't go out and buy anything. It was just what they could pick up on their raids and plundering. This is one of the guns that has been converted from a Civil War Springfield. You can see where they hinged the breech here and put the breech block on it. Prior to that, during the Civil War, they had to tear a paper cartridge, pour the powder in the barrel, draw the rammer, ram the cartridge down, and then return rammer, and then ready, aim, fire.
It's a costly time delay, right?
3 shots a minute.
Yeah.
Once they converted to these, about 15 shots a minute. The cartridge has 70 grains of black powder in it and 430 grains of lead. It is good for about 400 yards. And it has almost a half a ton of knockdown.
When LOZEN got older, they brought in the repeater, so did that change the way the game was played?
The repeaters have been around for quite a while, and it was just the civilians and the Indians seem to prefer them. Basically, it's sort of self-explanatory because you had here about 11 shots versus the military single shots. And these could be worked as fast as you could work the lever.
Why did the cavalry not use these?
They were hung up on the idea of a single-shot weapon of long range, and also there were certain people in the higher echelon that thought if the soldiers had a repeater, they'd waste ammunition if they could shoot it fast.
Is this a gun that the Indians might have coveted?
Well, yes, because they were usually on an ambush, and that wouldn't have been a problem maneuvering through the brush or getting on a horse with it because it doesn't have that much barrel. Yeah, it does.
And that's fairly light too, right?
Yes, it is. You can aim at the dogs, the coyotes.
The pressure was on for Hatch to solve the Apache problem. At last, his Apache scouts delivered the break he was looking for. They reported that Victorio and a large gathering of Chiricahua and Mescalero Apache were camped in the Embrio Basin in the San Andreas Mountains. In the spring of 1880, over 700 cavalry troops converged on LOZEN's tribe from the east and west. Hatch was determined that this time the Apache would have no chance of escape. The first to reach Embrio was Captain Carroll and 2 companies of cavalry. In spite of orders to wait until help arrived, Carroll and his troops attempted to catch LOZEN and Victorio by surprise. Taking a backdoor route over a ridge, they dropped down into Embrio Basin. But LOZEN and the Apache were waiting for them. The Chiricahua and Mescalero warriors, positioned on opposite ridges, had drawn the cavalry into a zone of fire. The Apache guns opened up on them from 3 sides. Pinned down in a withering crossfire, the cavalry hightailed it for higher ground.
One of the Buffalo soldiers said, "I'm never going to go up any more canyons with any more white officers." He said, "We're going to fight them the Indian way, or I'm not going to fight them."
Carroll and his troops were only saved by the cover of darkness. At first light, LOZEN and Victorio's warriors closed in on the soldiers, poised to finish them off. But the prayers of Carroll's men were answered. The cavalry reinforcements and Apache scouts reached Embrio just in time to save Carroll from total defeat. Pulling back into a defensive position, Victorio and LOZEN, with only 50 warriors, held off the combined forces of nearly 300 men.
Thomas Cruz, who was with the 6th Cavalry, said, "I know I didn't kill any Apache because I never saw any Apache. All I saw was a long, low ridge from which came smoke and bullets."
Doubling back out of the mountains and across the desert, LOZEN's band narrowly evaded hundreds of cavalry troops, riding hard to Embrio to close them in. With LOZEN guiding them, the Warm Springs Apache were able to slip out of the army's net.
Victorio and his people were worn down. They had very little ammunition. They were very tired. They were wounded. And I think that gets lost in most of the stories. to have a belief in LOZEN's power to protect you and let you know when the enemies were coming must have been a great comfort. It's hard to imagine being attacked and uprooted and on the run constantly. There were military officers who hated Native Americans, but Hatch, Gatewood felt very strongly that they were having to hunt down and shoot men who were fighting for their freedom, and they didn't like it.
With their enemies determined to hunt them down, LOZEN's band made for the shelter of the Black Range, and then headed south for the border to try and shake the cavalry off their trail. With the US cavalry bearing down on them, LOZEN and Victorio led their exhausted tribe south into Mexico. On the trail, one of the women of their group who was pregnant went into labor. Now LOZEN found that her roles as healer and midwife and as Victorio's key tactician were in conflict. She faced an agonizing decision. As a medicine woman, it was LOZEN's responsibility to stay behind with the expectant mother and help her through childbirth. But doing her duty meant leaving Victorio and her band vulnerable to attack. Victorio could not risk stopping. He would have to press on with the others for Mexico. With the life of the mother and a Chiricahua child at stake, LOZEN realized she had no choice but to stay behind. As the cavalry closed in, LOZEN and the expectant mother hid. In silence, the Apache woman endured the pain of childbirth. When Victoria and the Warm Springs Apache crossed into Mexico, the Mexican cavalry moved in, intent on settling old scores. For once, the enemy had been able to catch Victorio by surprise. Down to their last rounds of ammunition, his warriors fought desperately, but were overwhelmed. On October 14th, 1880, Victorio fired his last bullet. Of the 400 Chiricahua in LOZEN's band, only 17 escaped the massacre at Tres Castillos. The survivors strongly believe that had LOZEN been with them, Victorio never would have ridden into the Mexican cavalry's trap. LOZEN and the last free Apache warriors would hold out for another 5 years. She had lost everything but her will to fight. By October 1880, the Victorio Wars had reached their bloody conclusion. LOZEN's brother and best friend was gone, and most of her tribe wiped out. But for LOZEN, there was more war to come. She and 70-year-old leader Nane joined with Geronimo and the last of the free Apaches, and what they were after was vengeance. Lawless, now in her 40s, spent the next 6 years punishing the army camps and settlements that had brought her tribe's destruction. At one count, their band was down to 16 warriors, 12 women, and 6 children. The U.S. Army deployed 5,000 soldiers and Apache scouts to hunt them down. The war was lost, but they were far from defeated. They lashed out at their enemies in a series of ferocious raids.
They were very bitter, they were angry, and they were lashing out in the only way they knew how.
What do you think, if your land was taken away that's covered maybe 3-4 states, you'll never get it back?
By the summer of 1886, 6 years after Victorio's death, there was nowhere left for Lawless and the others to run. Retreating deep into Mexico, they made camp in the Sierra Madre Mountains. But even there, the U.S. cavalry and their Apache scouts tracked them down. They had been at war for most of their lives and were desperate to be with their families. By now they had heard that the U.S. government had removed most of the captive Chiricahua to prison camps in Florida. The choice for Lawless and Geronimo was clear: to die fighting or to become prisoners, joining what remained of their people in a strange and distant land. Many believe that Lawless and the other women in the band were instrumental in convincing Geronimo that the time had come to lay down their guns.
If there was no women warriors there, I think Geronimo could have just fought till the last man. I believe the women warriors were thinking about the survival of the tribe. I think they did make a big difference in this final surrender.
In September of 1886, 2 Apache scouts working for the U.S. Army approached Geronimo in his Sierra Madre hideout. They had come to convince Geronimo to accept the U.S. Army's final terms of surrender. The promise to Geronimo was 2 years imprisonment with their families, after which they would be allowed to return to a reservation in New Mexico. Two years became 28 years of confinement.
They were in prison in St. Augustine, Florida. Then they didn't know what to do with them. They were finally moved to Alabama. They were exposed to tuberculosis and died. And that's where Lawless, from accounts told to us, that's where Lawless is buried in an unmarked grave. 28 long years of imprisonment, and they never came back to their homelands. That is emotional.
This photo of the last free Apache to surrender to the U.S. Army was taken in front of the train on its way to prison camps in Florida. In front is the Army's prize captive, Geronimo. Behind him are a group of Apache women, identified only as wives of the male warriors, except for one. Nobody is certain, but many Apache believe that this unidentified woman is the only picture of their remarkable woman warrior, Lawless.
When you look out of the vastness and the emptiness of this landscape, you have to ask who gained what from the Apache's loss. Barely 100 years after Lawson's death, the gold mines are abandoned, and the train tracks, which opened up a new era in the West, are relics of the past. It's hard to believe that Lawson and her people were lied to and hunted down for the sake of a quick buck. And when you consider that America prides itself on being the sum of so many parts, it's a crime to realize that there was room enough for everyone but the people who got here first.